Good evening, everyone. It is February 13th, 2024. We're here for a work session of the City Council. And before we begin, we just learned that a sergeant with the Sheridan Police Department was killed serving a warrant today. So a quick moment of silence for him. Thank you, everyone. Our thoughts are certainly with the family and those in the Sheridan Police Department and the community. Awful news. Council members, we're going to begin the meeting with public comments on non-agenda items. So if there's anyone in the room that wishes to speak to the council on any item, please go ahead and come forward in the room. Seeing none, we'll close public comment and we'll move on to the first work session, which is the auditor's report. Director Wade. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thanks. It's always nice to see you all. Honorable Mayor, City Councilors, the first part of our work session this evening will be a joint presentation, first by the auditor and then by staff, to walk you through this year's audit and then the annual comprehensive financial report. And so our one of our audit partners, Micah Klinger, will lead off this evening.
Mr. Klinger, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Some slides up. There we are. Honorable Mayor, City Council members, thank you for your time this evening. As Director Wade mentioned, my name is Micah Klinger. I'm one of the audit partners with Klinger Hagerman. This was the second annual audit that we, as our firm, has completed for the City of Laramie for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2023. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this slide just gives a brief overview of what we're going to go through today. We're going to give a high-level executive summary, kind of a brief discussion over internal control over financial reporting. We're going to discuss the results of the single audit of the city's federal awards. And then there are other required communications that we are required to communicate to you as governance at the conclusion of the audit. And just moving to the next slide. Professional standards require that we communicate with you regarding matters related to the financial statement audit that are, in our professional judgment, significant and relevant to your responsibilities of those, as those charged with governance. Back in September, on September 26, 2013, my partner, Abby Hagerman, presented to you kind of our pre-audit communications and the things that we were going to focus on as it related to our audit, including the nature, scope, and timing of our audit procedures. This communication today is intended to elaborate on the significant findings from our audit, including our views on the qualitative aspects of the City of Laramie's financial statements, including its accounting disclosures and other presentations. We are pleased to be able to serve the city and look forward to discussing our findings and results further. If we can go to, there we are. So the status of our audit. We have completed our audit of the financial statements for the year ended June 30th, 2023. Our audit was conducted in accordance with general auditing standards in the United States of America and government auditing standards. So there are two different sets of auditing standards that we are required to follow for municipalities. The audit of the financial statements does not relieve management or those charged in governance of their responsibilities as it relates to the reporting of the city's financial information. The objective of the audit was to obtain reasonable, not absolute, assurance about whether the financial statements are free from material misstatements. And at a high level is what that means is that there would be no misstatements that would be significant enough that it would affect the decision-making of any of the users of the financial statements of the city. The scope of the work performed was substantially the same as what was communicated to you back in the meeting back in September. Really, you're going to steal the thunder right out of the gate right here. This last bullet point is really the most important item, and that is the fact that we issued an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, and we released our report on January 19th, 2024. So an unmodified opinion is also kind of referred to as a clean opinion, and that's exactly what you want. Stepping further, kind of into this next slide, there's a lot of information, but I'll try to condense it down a little bit. I know that Director Wade and her team will be going over the financial statements and the ACFR, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, in a little more depth. As it pertains to this slide, is what that means is there are the basic financial statements in the ACFR. There are also notes to the financial statement, and then there are also 2 or 3 different other types of information that are in your financial statements. There are what they call required supplemental information, which is just different information that's required to be included for an audit that's done in accordance with government auditing standards. The information in your financial statements that pertains to the primary items are your management discussion and analysis, or MD&A. And then there is also other required information related to your pension disclosures, in addition to disclosures related to OPEB. And the reason we bring that up is so we give an opinion over the basic financial statements. We do not audit the RSI and do not express an opinion on that information. However, under our auditing standards, we are required to reconcile that information to the basic financial statements to make sure that there are no material misstatements in there, but we do not express an opinion on that. There is other information in the back of your financial statements that include combining or individual non-major fund statements. So it goes into a little more depth where there might be combining statements that show all of your special revenue funds and additional information along with that. We do give an in relation to opinion over that information, meaning we test the information that's there, ensure that it all ties back, that it agrees to what's presented in the financial statements, and we give an opinion in relation to that information that there is nothing that's materially misstated. And then lastly on this slide, kind of the last section, we were not engaged to report on introductory section information, statistical information that's at the very back, several different things like that, just kind of ancillary stuff. That being said, if we go to the next page, we do have a responsibility to read that information to make sure that there are no inconsistencies in that information with what's presented there and what's presented in your financial statements. And so we do go ahead and do that, although we do not give an opinion over that information. Second paragraph on this slide, in accordance with professional standards, like I said, we do read that information to ensure that there are no discrepancies. And lastly, our responsibility also as the auditors to the city is to include calling to management's attention any information that we believe would be a material misstatement to the city's financial statements, that would be a misstatement of fact. And we're happy to report that we did not identify any such items that we believe would have been a material misstatement of fact that would have required kind of an adjustment to the financial statements. And that is really kind of a testament to your team that they've put a lot of work in during the year to make sure that the financial statements are materially correct and accurate. Moving to the next slide, just something we like to draw attention to. The following summarizes the more significant required communications related to our audit concerning the city of Laramie's accounting principles and practices and estimates. The main thing that we want to draw your attention to is that note 1 in the financial statements. It's about 15 or 20 pages, but it summarizes all of the key accounting principles and whatnot that the city has that drives or helps manage the accounting for the city. The last bullet point on this page, we just like to draw attention if there are any significant changes to those significant accounting principles. There were none during the year under audit, with the exception of a new accounting standard that was implemented by the city related to subscription-based information technology arrangements, and that just required the city have to account for those types of arrangements a little bit differently than they previously did. Moving to the next slide, this next slide just provides a high-level summary of significant estimates that can be found in your financial statements. We like to bring attention to this because oftentimes all numbers aren't necessarily created equal. You know, cash is cash, but you know, if you have an allowance for bad debt or something in that nature, that's what we would describe as an estimate. And this table on this screen just provides a high-level summary of the significant accounting estimates that can be found in the city's financial statements. And this is very similar to previous years. There are no significant changes related to this, with the exception of estimates related to that accounting standard that I just previously mentioned on the prior slide, related to GASB 96 and the implementation of subscription-based technology arrangements. Moving on to the next slide, just a couple of points that we're required to communicate to you as the auditors. The first one just involves management's cooperation. Management's cooperation was excellent. If we had had any issues or challenges, we would be required to communicate that to you as the governance body. We're happy to report that everything was very good. Everything that we requested to look at, we were provided. Anyone that we wanted to talk to as part of our audit procedures, we were able to talk to. The last paragraph on this slide involves management representations. At the conclusion of the audit, we requested a management representation letter that includes a list of representations. And it's stuff like the management is representing that they provided us all the information that we requested, those types of things, and we obtained that management representation letter from management on the same day that we issued the financial statements, which was January 19th, 2024. Moving into this next slide, in planning and performing our audit of the financial statements, we do look at the city's internal controls, and we look at it quite heavily. The primary purpose for what we do as it relates to evaluating the internal controls is to use that as a part of our risk assessment for developing our audit, the timing and type of audit procedures that we perform. We like to bring this up because there is a distinction between public companies, companies that may be listed on the stock exchange where their auditors are actually giving an opinion over the operating effectiveness of those internal controls. That is not something that is not an opinion that is given for private companies. However, we do, especially with an organization or a municipality the size of the city, we do a lot of work related to internal controls. And if we were to have found any significant matters, we would be reporting those to you, and we're happy to report that we did not identify any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. Although they could exist, we did not identify any as part of our audit procedures. Moving on, the single audit. The single audit involves the audit of the federal awards that the city received and expended during the year under audit. If an entity receives over $750,000 or expends more than $750,000 in federal expenditures in a given year, they're required to have a single audit. The single audit is performed in accordance with the uniform guidance. That's kind of what the first paragraph talks about. Really kind of the most important takeaway are the paragraphs 2 and 3 in that final point on this slide, which involves, as part of the single audit, similar to the financial statements, we do evaluate internal controls, but although we are required to test the operating effectiveness of internal controls over compliance as it relates to major programs that are selected for testing. And then we also test the compliance that are directed material or the significant compliance requirements for those major programs. We're happy to report that we issued an unmodified opinion on the major program that was selected. The second to last paragraph kind of talks about how much there was in federal expenditures. There was a little more than $2.1 million, and the federal program that we audited was the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program, and that was comprised of approximately $1.73 million of that total $2.1 million. So that's what we tested as part of the audit, and we had no issues to report as it pertains to that. These next several slides, I'm not going to go into too much detail. These are just required communications that we are required to communicate at the conclusion of the audit based off from our auditing standards. I'm going to really just hit kind of the left items on each of these slides. And to kind of summarize this in general, there are several different areas. If something like this were to have occurred, we'd be required to communicate it to you, and none of these items did happen. But we'll talk just briefly through each one. If there were significant changes to the planned audit strategy or significant risks that were identified subsequent to our initial meeting with the council, we'd be required to communicate that. There were no significant changes. Obtaining information from those charged with governments relevant to the audit. There were no material matters noted that were relevant that we obtained subsequent to kind of our initial planning of the audit. If applicable, the nature and extent of specialized skills or knowledge that we would have had to have gone out to obtain to be able to complete the audit, we did not have to go out and acquire any additional skills or specialized skills that we did not already have within the firm. Moving to the next page. We would be required to communicate to the council if there had been consultations with other accountants that management had made that we became aware of. Usually that's referred to as opinion shopping. If we were to have identified a matter and management were to say, hey, auditors, we don't like what you're saying to us, we're going to go talk with this other firm down the road, would be required to communicate that to you. We did not identify any such matter. The middle area on this slide, significant findings and issues arising during the audit in connection with any related parties of the city, we'd be required to communicate that. We did not become aware of any. And finally, on the last item on this slide, any significant findings or issues arising during the audit that were discussed or were the subject of correspondence with management. This really kind of comes down to if there were any matters that were discussed in regards to kind of retaining us as the auditors, and there were no such matters. Moving to the next slide, if there had been any significant disagreements with management, would be required to communicate that. Any significant difficulties entered during the audit or encountered during the audit, and any matters that are difficult or contentious, for that matter, we would be required to communicate, and we're happy to report there were no such items. And then lastly, if applicable, other matters significant to the oversight of the city's financial statements or financial reporting process, including complaints or concerns regarding accounting matters, we'd be required to communicate those items, and we're happy to report there were no such items. And so that really brings us to the end. I know it may be a little benign or a little boring, but boring's good when it comes to audits. But with that, I would like to just thank the city's team, the management team. They were very good to work with. You have a very good group in place, and so thank you. And with that, I would like to open up to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Klinger. Yeah, we sure agree with you there. Council members, any questions for Mr. Klinger? And City Clerk, I might be out of practice here. It's occurring to me I'm not on the Zoom call yet. So if you see anyone raising their hand over there on Zoom, I'll be joining that shortly.
We have Councilor Pierce, but no hand raised.
Okay, great. All right, Mr. Klinger, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Good
Director.
evening
Yeah.
I have the pleasure of reviewing, giving you an overview of our annual comprehensive financial report this evening. I've seen the same council members for a couple of years now, and so I apologize in advance if some of the content is repetitive, but I feel like education is a really important part of this work session. And so I want to make sure that I take the time to explain some of the concepts that do make the ACFR, which can be intimidating to many users, I think, a little bit more accessible. City Clerk, if you could go to the first slide of the presentation. We have some pretty simple goals for tonight's work session. First, we want to just introduce the council and any citizens to our annual financial report and highlight staff responsibilities in preparing that report. You just heard from our auditors, so we're going to give you the other side of that equation. We also want to highlight accounting knowledge or just general knowledge that we think is essential to using this report, thereby increasing accessibility and hopefully transparency, because knowledge, if you don't have the right knowledge, that can be a barrier to true financial transparency. I'll provide a brief overview of specific ACFR sections and tell you, based on your level of use, how I recommend you use it to learn a little bit more about the city's financial condition. And I'll also wrap up with highlights from the fiscal year 2023 report. And so that's where we'll talk about the results of operations from fiscal year 2023. City Clerk, next slide. So as our audit partner, Mr. Klinga, referred, the ACFR is staff's responsibility. It's not something that we can farm out to our auditors. We have to have sufficient knowledge to prepare the report. We can contract for some services with our auditors if we choose, but we have to oversee that work because that's an important part of management's responsibility for that financial reporting. Part of preparing the ACFR, it starts really with audit preparation. And you hear a lot of people talk about audit preparation. What we mean when we say that is balance substantiation in the balance sheet, which means, do you have documentation to support each of those balances that you're recording? Because there's proof for each one of those. So that's the first part. The second part is variance analysis. So a lot of work that we do on revenue and expenses happens month to month when we're reviewing the incoming receipts and the outgoing expenditures. However, even at the end of the year, part of our work is doing variance analysis in those income statement accounts to make sure that we haven't improperly classified anything and our systems are working as they should be. So we're fully responsible for that audit preparation and making sure that transactions are recorded in accordance with GAAP. That's generally accepted accounting principles. Right now, I'm going to refer to it just as GAAP, but that's a very common term for this type of presentation. City staff are also responsible, and this item, in my opinion, especially as I age in practice, is one of the most important things to me. We're responsible for the design and implementation and maintenance of internal controls that allow for fair financial statements to actually be prepared. And so those systems in which these financial transactions and events occur, whether that's our revenue system or our expenditure system, or maybe even some of our internal systems for who implements accounting standards and the level of skill you have to do that and the level of oversight that goes into that. Those systems are really so much a part of producing accurate financial statements. It is not just about knowing how to do technical accounting standards. Next slide. We do have an annual audit requirement. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think the council and public are probably aware of this point. We're required to have an audit by Wyoming state statute. I give you that reference 16.4.121 and present those sections of statute to you if you want to read those further. Next slide. So the next few slides we're going to go through, these are what I call my what is, the what is series. And what I try to do with any presentation or educational offering is to put myself in the shoes of the user of that training and say, okay, what might someone want to know? What are language barriers that might be present that won't even allow us to talk about it until I address these things? The first is, well, what even is an ACFR? Well, it's an annual comprehensive financial report. It's a standardized best practice format for annual governmental financial reporting prepared in accordance with GAAP. Governments do not have to prepare an ACFR. It's an expanded type of report. But we at the city do have to record transactions in accordance with GAAP. We're required to do so by state statute. An ACFR is a standardized document. So if you pick up an ACFR from the city of Cheyenne and the city of Laramie, what you can expect is that you're going to see the same sections, introductory, financial, statistical, and that you'll see the same information in those sections to the extent that those entities engage in similar types of activities. That's an important point because, as we know, there's lots of ways, for example, to fund a pension plan. Wyoming has one way, but if you were to look at an ACFR from another state, you might find an entirely different arrangement, and that's an important thing to remember. So we elect to fulfill our annual reporting responsibility with this ACFR, which also allows us to participate in the GFOA's Certificate of Excellence for Financial Reporting program. We have been part of this program or receiving this award for 46 years. It is quite valuable. So when you participate, you pay a nominal fee for your ACFR to be vetted by a team of highly trained professionals. So folks that work at the GFOA, CPAs, fellow practitioners, and they're trained to give you feedback on common ACFR missteps or to make improvements that the GFOA is really pushing forward. And so they'll identify what they feel are kind of common weaknesses and then move us all along to make sure that our ACFRs are as good as they can be. This last year in particular, one of the comments that we got resulted in a significant change through the result of some additional research. And so I'm going to talk about that later on. But I do love that we participate in this program. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about these things called GAAP, which you learn about really early on in accounting school, and they never go away. And they never go away because these are the principles by which we live, really. They're a set of standards and interpretations for the accounting and reporting of financial transactions and events. And the reason it's financial transactions and events is because in accounting, especially in like the economic resources measurement focus, we don't just measure expenses and revenue coming in. We do often measure things economically, and that's where those events come into play, because we all know there are things we can engage in that have value that don't bring in that cash. There are two standard-setting bodies that promulgate GAAP in the U.S. The first is the FASB, the second is the GASB. There's not one over the other, they're absolutely equal. The FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, sets standards for private and not-for-profit entities. The GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, sets standards for government entities. And I will tell you that the standards are equally complex in both. So one doesn't have a leg up on the other, and I feel like the GASB tries to compete with the GASB sometimes these days in its complexity. So it just gets more and more interesting. I would note that standards are principles-based rather than rules-based. Although a plethora of technical rules exist within each standard, the reason that's really important is that there's no way that you're going to write an accounting standard that's going to cover every transaction an entity might have. So it's super important that we keep those principle-based standards intact. I've already mentioned that we are required to use GAAP by state statute, and I would also note, as I think you're all aware, that GAAP change every year with the implementation of new accounting standards, and those seem to be getting bigger and bigger as we move ahead in time. So why are these GAAP important? Well, I think they're really important, mainly for three reasons. First, they provide a common framework for disclosures, those things that come after the financial statements, which in my opinion are just as important as the financial statements, because it's really tough to understand those financials without looking at those disclosures. Secondarily, they ensure that transactions are accounted, that like transactions are accounted for similarly between entities. And so one of the things you start to realize as you practice accounting is that it really is all about measurement. And if you can't rely on maybe Cheyenne's ACFR and our ACFR to have the same measurement for a type of transaction, all of a sudden you can't compare. And what about our bond issuers? And what about our governing bodies, right? We really need that information to be consistent because that's the end goal. We really are producing a product for either internal or external stakeholders to be used in a decision-making process. Next slide. Next, let's just talk about what's in a financial statement. You hear people talk about financial statements a lot, and what they tend to mean by that is a group of two, a balance sheet and an income statement of some type. In government, in our ACFR, our balance sheets are called the balance sheets and the statements of net position, depending on what statement you're looking at. And those statements contain measurement as of a date and time. So as of June 30, end of the fiscal year, these are the balances in these accounts. The balance sheets are where you're going to find assets, liabilities, deferred inflows and outflows of resources, and net position and fund balance. The income statement is where you're going to see changes in the period that relate to one of those balance sheets. On the income statement, you're going to see revenues, expenditures are expenses, and other financing sources and uses. And what's really important to remember is that the changes quantified on the income statement represent the difference between last year's ending fund balance or net position on the balance sheet and the current year totals. And so I always recommend that folks use these statements together and don't divorce them off and silo them, because they really do complement each other. Next slide. Next, we need to talk about what's in a financial statement number. And that depends on the measurement focus and basis of accounting in governments. So as you all know, government actually does, in an ACFR, we do account for things on two different bases of accounting. The first basis of accounting is the current financial resources measurement focus and the modified accrual basis of accounting. And that approach is used on our governmental fund financial statements and only on those statements. That basis, it accounts for resources that impact near-term liquidity and is really, really similar to the basis we use in budgeting. So I love in government that we use this basis, because I feel like it makes those financials transparent in a way that the other basis, the modified or the accrual basis, just simply doesn't for most of our users. And so when you look at those governmental fund statements, think this is pretty similar to budget. I think that's a fair comparison. It's not exact, but very close. The government-wide and proprietary fund financial statements are prepared using the economic resources measurement focus and accrual basis of accounting. So this approach is the same as the private sector, and it accounts for economic resources in addition to resources that impact near-term liquidity. One of the things that I really liked about Micah's presentation is he pointed out that cash is always cash. And that's one of the things that I was actually going to say on this slide too. There are some balances that don't change. Cash, investments, accounts receivable, those are balances that are going to be valued the same in both of these bases. It's really when you get into transactions like debt and capital assets and pension that you see differences, and that's what the next slide is about. So what I've done here is I've just compared the two different ways to measure transactions under the two bases of accounting. And I'll just go over two of these examples with you here at the presentation today. The first would be with capital assets, because I think folks are pretty familiar. So let's just envision a scenario where we buy a police car for $50,000. In the modified accrual statements, that's just simply a capital outlay expenditure. There's no asset recorded, there's no depreciation over time. In the modified accrual basis, or the accrual basis of accounting, that capital outlay is not an expense when you incur it. The police car would be capitalized, made a capital asset, put on the balance sheet, and the expense would be amortized, depreciated over the useful life of that vehicle. And that would be the way that expense would be recognized over multiple years rather than in 1 year. So you can see how that's really similar to how we budget, right? That modified accrual basis versus that economic resources measurement focus. The last example would be for pension. So as you might guess, pension expenditure in the modified accrual basis is simply what the city incurs for what we must contribute to the pension plans based on our statutorily required rates. In the accrual basis, the pension expense is very different. It's wildly different by millions of dollars. It's the proportionate share of Wyoming retirement system's actuarially determined net pension liability plus amortization of deferred inflows and outflows of resources. And so these numbers can get really different really quickly. And when I say really different, all of these are millions of dollars different. Next slide. So we're done with the what is slide series. Now we're going to just talk about the sections of the ACFR. So every ACFR is going to have an introductory and a financial section. The introductory section is great for giving folks who love to read that full ACFR an overview of the community. They're going to see a letter of transmittal, an org chart, our certificate of achievement, a list of all you guys, a list of management, and it's just going to orient the reader to the community that the ACFR is generated for. The financial section is where you would expect to find most of the data that you would use for financial analysis. That's going to include the independent auditor's report, management's discussion and analysis, the basic financials, the notes, required supplementary information, and so on. If I were a user wanting to start to use the ACFR but didn't want to maybe read the entire thing, I would start by reading the management's discussion and analysis. That's not opinion. You have to talk about why your financial position changes in each type of statement over the year, and you have to actually explain all of that change. And so it's a great, 25 pages that really give you an overview not only of condensed statements, but why balances change from year to year. And when we think about financial health, that's really important. For users who want a little bit more than that, I would recommend that they move on to the basic financial statements and the notes after they read the MD&A. I really, really encourage people to not use the financial statements without using the notes, just to make sure that they have that reference to figure out any balances that they maybe don't understand. They also clearly could call staff, and we would be happy to help explain things if they want to learn more, but they don't really want to read those notes. City Clerk, next slide. An ACFR will wrap up with a statistical section, which folks who read full ACFRs love. It will give you history over time, 10-year history, revenue capacity, debt capacity, some economic indicators, demographic stuff, so you can really see how communities are changing over time. The information in the statistical section, as in all of these sections, is mandated. We don't have the ability to just throw stuff in there that we might like. And so sometimes I feel that the economic indicators in particular are not as relevant to Laramie as they might be to other places, but still really good stuff to watch. And then there's a small other section at the end of the report with one of the independent auditor's reports. We can move on. So we'll dive into some highlights from 2023. Of course, as you know from Micah's presentation, we had an unmodified audit opinion with no identified material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal controls. Audit testing also did not disclose instances of non-compliance, and that's exactly what we want. But when that isn't the result, that's okay too, because that helps us learn how to do things better. In our governmental fund balances for the end of the year, we closed at $77.8 million. That's all governmental funds. It's not just the general fund. And that was an $8.7 million increase from the prior year, which is pretty significant. Major changes include an increase of $3.7 million in the SPT tax fund and $5.2 million in the general fund. Sales and use tax collections were a big driver in those changes. Across all funds, they increased $4.2 million, which was 23%. 3.1 of that was in the general fund, and 1.1 of that was in the SPT fund. Next slide. In the general fund, you all know from budget, we spend a lot of time on the general fund, just like we do in our enterprise operations, because the general fund pays for many staff salaries at the city of Laramie, most of them, in fact. And so we really watch the financial health of this fund because it bears a lot of our ongoing costs and a lot of our personnel costs in particular, just due to the nature of this fund. Overall, in the general fund, revenue grew by $6.1 million, or 20%, which is outstanding. The biggest revenue growth, 3 areas. $3.1 million in sales and use tax, which we've already talked about. $1.2 million in investment income. About half of that is due to just changes in the interest rate environment. The other half is due to the change in our cash and investment strategy. And we had a $1 million increase in charges for services, which we expect to be temporary. It's due to UW activity in building permits and plan review. The estimated one-time sales and use tax collections were around 2.5 million. So based on my current estimate, I think the ongoing growth we can expect from 2023 was around 0.6 or 0.7 million. And we do watch that because we don't want to start balancing our money on sales and use tax collections that we don't expect to be ongoing over time. We want to use those more as one-time or more limited use proceeds. Expenditures grew by $4.1 million or 15%. $2 million of this growth was in personnel cost. That's about half broken out into fire services and half for the rest of the employees in the general fund. There are some pretty good reasons for that in the last year, including some one-time stipends that fire were awarded last year. So part of that growth in fire is not ongoing. $1.1 million of the increase was for general operating cost increases. And remember, this is the year that the inflation really started to ramp up. And so we see this across city funds. The remaining $1 million in growth was due to capital outlay and debt service. Governmental activities net position, we had a $125 million balance as of the end of the fiscal year, which was a $17.4 million increase from the prior year. We had almost $10 million in recognized revenue for the city's proportionate share of the state's $55 million contribution to the Fire Pension A plan, presented as an extraordinary item because it is indeed unusual, infrequent, and outside of management's control. Overall revenue increased by $12.4 million, so that extraordinary item is separate, and then we have this increase in revenue of 12.4. $3 million of that increase was in program revenue, that's charges for services, capital grants, operating grants. We had a $9.4 million increase in general revenue. We've talked about that sales and use tax. We also had growth in intergovernmental revenue, and miscellaneous sources grew by $4 million from stop loss payments alone. The council is aware of the year we had in the health insurance fund, and you're going to see that expenses grew by $49.8 million. $43.4 million of that change was from the GASB 68 pension expense adjustments, and $3.8 million of that increase was for health insurance claims cost. So you see that $4 million in increased revenue and the $3.8 in increased expenses for the health insurance fund. Next slide. In the business type activities net position, we have a $186.9 million balance as of June 30, which was a $9.6 million increase from the prior year. Revenue grew by $4.5 million. 3.1 of that was in program revenue, most of that in capital grants, $2.5 million. Only a $0.6 million increase in charges for services, which is what we would have expected because we're doing very small rate increases. We had a $1.4 million increase in general revenue. Most all of that was related to investment income. I've already explained the reasons for that. Expenses grew by around $2.4 million across water, wastewater, and solid waste funds. I've given you the breakout for each area here. What I think was notable in water and wastewater was that most of their growth in expenses was not due to personnel. They had a lot of attrition, and so their increases were really driven by that inflationary environment that hit that operation hard. In solid waste, the increase was about half personnel and half supplies, which is more typical. It's what we would expect to see. Got just 2 more slides here and we'll wrap it up. We did have some accounting standard implementation this year, accounting changes, and other matters that I'd like to disclose to you that I think are important. We evaluated multiple standards for implementation this year, some with no accounting impact. I've disclosed those to you. We did implement 2 standards, GASB 96, which is subscription-based IT arrangements, and GASB 99, which is an omnibus. The GASB 99 had no really significant changes. The subscription-based IT arrangements did actually change financial reporting for those types of transactions quite a bit. There were not many of these transactions overall. There were less than 10, and we were definitely accounting for these things before. But what the GASB will do when they see inconsistencies in practice is they'll work on standards, there'll be comment periods, and then we'll implement these standards that result in better consistency between users. And with the subscription-based IT arrangements, what we have now are intangible right-to-use assets for multi-year subscription arrangements for things like software, that we also recognize a liability for because we have future payments related to that subscription. And so it's pretty simple in concept, but a lot of work when you get into the weeds and in practice. And Louise Johnson is here with us tonight. She led the implementation of that standard, and she did a fantastic job, so I just want to recognize her briefly. I also want to disclose an accounting change we made this year for a new allocation method used to distribute the net pension liability related deferred inflows and outflows of resources and pension expense between funds that participate in the public employee pension plan. When we implemented this standard in 2016 or 2017, I don't remember the year now, I had a one-pronged allocation method that I developed to distribute these costs, and that method had really outgrown its usefulness. And so I tweaked that a little bit this year, and anytime you do that and make those changes, you actually disclose those to your governing body, to the public, and in the document. So I wanted to let you all know that. We also should acknowledge that our audit was delayed just slightly. We issued on January the 19th. The statutorily required date is December the 31st. We were delayed because on December 20th, the day before we planned to issue, we actually got the GFOA award packet from the prior year and the comments associated with that award. And one of those comments really gave us pause, and it was about a deferred outflow related to the Fire Pension A funding. And so I talked with the auditors, and we all decided, you know, this warrants more research. The timing could not be worse. We're just going to do what we know we need to do. And the auditors recommended, and I agreed, that we should do a GASB technical inquiry. And in the source of that inquiry, we found that we should also be recognizing revenue for that $10 million for the state's contribution to that plan. And we would not have known that absent that comment. And so,
Councilor Doherty, please.
While you're on the topic, is that what, with the highlights on page, I think it was like page 15, where you said that 9.9 million in recognized revenue from the city's proportionate share? Okay, because I couldn't figure that out. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Back to you.
So I think that process went really well, and I think it's also just a great example of how, you know, the universe watches out for us, however you think about that. You know, the day before issuance, we get this comment that lets us do this little bit more research that actually results, and I've never had that happen before in a type of material change. And so we got exactly what we needed with weird timing, for sure. Aside. And I'd just like to close today. You know, it's been a wild year for the finance team. And as I was putting together this presentation, I just really didn't feel that I could be standing up here talking to you as an individual, not acknowledging everything else that has gone on this year first and foremost, and all the other folks that do just as much work as I do to make this thing happen. And so in 2023, I want to acknowledge Finance Manager Jen Malmborg, who has changed all of our lives by being here, lead accountant Louise Johnson, accountant Spencer Katuri, accounting analyst Mary Palmer, and then we have a couple of new team members who just started. And in closing, I just want to take you through this little chart briefly and highlight all the stuff these folks have done this year, in addition to their normal jobs. We just got fully staffed too, so short-staffed. We have designed and tested new ERP software modules. We've completed a police FLSA cycle change, which is not simple. We completed our ERP training initiative with 50+ sessions, plus we have a full content library that we more or less created. No audit findings. We onboarded 2 new employees. We completed a delayed audit, so as we were doing budget last year, we were also doing an audit. We implemented a major accounting standard. We implemented a huge health insurance change, which was quite significant for our area because payroll falls in the finance area. And we changed our bank and investment strategy. And so this slide celebrates the work of that team that I am so proud of and so grateful for every day. Thank you. And at this time, I would love to open it up for any questions you may have.
Director Wade, thank you. You have shared some of the workload with the finance team with the finance committee, and you know, it's not lost on council the lift that you all are doing right now. So thank you to you and your team. Council members, do you have any questions? Counselor Doherty, please, have at it.
I was just wondering if you could give an example when you talk about the economic resources, because I couldn't wrap my head around that either. I mean, I'll read the report and then I'll get more information, but can you just give an example of what's covered under that?
Honorable Mayor, if I may.
Please.
Let's go back to the example of capital assets. And so the way that you or I would think about a capital asset from a budget standpoint, we would buy that police car and you'd see a $50,000 expenditure. In the economic resources measurement focus, you would see an asset on the balance sheet for $50,000 and no expenses at all in that first year. Let's assume it had a 5-year life. Then you would see in the next year a $10,000 expense for the first year of that life, and you'd see that $10,000 expense all 5 years until the value of that asset had been depreciated out. So it's recognizing that economic life of the asset, not that more current in and out associated with it. Debt behaves in the same way. But I think the asset example is one that a lot of people understand. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any other questions, councilors? Okay, we're going to go to the public on this work session. If any member of the public has any questions, comments for this work session, go ahead and come forward in the room. Raise your hand if you're on Zoom. Seeing none, we will close the public comment period. And council, before we close, Director Wade, thank you again. Thank you to your team. And Mr. Klinger, thank you as well. All right, we're going to close that work session, move on to our next work session, which is the Laramie Police Department Annual Bias Crime Report. Chief Brown. We appreciate you being here. Welcome.
Good evening, Mayor. Thanks for having me. Council members, thank you. I appreciate it. So this will be a shorter report, which I'm glad to say. So this is my second year reporting on our annual bias crime reports. And so as you can see here, the city of Laramie has an ordinance that requires the police department to report this annually to the council, and it also says that it should be documented in the council minutes. There's two different types of reporting that are still used at the national level. The UCR, which is the Uniform Crime Report, it was anticipated that it would not be used after 2021, and that was our federal partners' goal. However, they've had a difficult time transitioning a lot of agencies, specifically large agencies such as LAPD, NYPD, San Francisco PD, and really small agencies in rural communities to the new NIBR system. And part of the reason for that is the NIBR system actually separates crimes, where the UCR reporting system would take the highest crime involved in an incident. An example I like to use is if there's a homicide. Then the UCR we would strictly report a homicide to our federal partners. Now, if what caused that homicide was a domestic violence situation, in the new NIBR's reporting system, you'd have two incidents. You could have it at the same date, approximately the same time, say 10 minutes apart, where a domestic violence situation occurs, and then 10 minutes later, there's a homicide. Both would be reported as one incident, but two separate crimes. So NIBR's actually gives our federal partners a better idea of what's occurring across the nation. The problem we're having right now is a lot of states haven't fully implemented it. I believe I'll show you here in a minute on a slide, but I think 21 states fully have, and Wyoming is not one of those states. So what are we reporting on tonight? We have two different types of crimes that were reported, two incidents that we're reporting on. The first one is an incident. And basically this is an incident that's motivated presumably by hate. And one of the incidents that I'm reporting on tonight is what's been occurring on council, at the beginning of the meetings, and then also some mailers that have been received by council members. And what you have there is an ideology that's presumably occurring, or an incident that's presumably occurring because of hate or motivated by hate. The second one is a hate crime, and at the federal level, a crime motivated by bias against race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. And the best way that I can explain this is a hate crime is a crime, and then coupled with a motivation for committing the crime based on one of these biases. So you have to have both. Just having the motivation and the bias and speaking out to that, a lot of those speeches, words, conversations are protected under the First Amendment. So you have to have a crime associated with it. Once again, some of the definitions for the hate crime. The national expectation for reporting is still the UCR program definition. We do expect that to move to NIBRS here in the next 2 or 3 years. I believe this year, either this year or next year, LAPD, NYPD, San Francisco PD, all of the major 4 organizations across the United States are supposed to be moving completely to NIBRS. And that'll match us. We did it a few years ago, and we've been reporting our NIBRS numbers, I believe, since 2017, but we have been doing it consistently since I've been here as the chief. So there's 2 instances that I'll talk to you about tonight. There's actually a third one that I'll mention too, that ended up not being a bias-related incident, but the first one occurred at the soup kitchen. It was a police report taken by us. We believe the individual to have be in some sort of mental crises, as he had some previous mental diagnoses. And then also a transient who was not a resident of our community. And an assault occurred, a racial slur was used, and the individual was arrested and trespassed from the soup kitchen. And I've had an opportunity to speak with the director of the soup kitchen, the officer who took the report, and reviewing the report, and we're confident that that individual is no longer in our community. And then the second incident is the ones that you guys have experienced here at council. And I reached out to our federal partners to kind of determine how they wanted us to report this. So what we've done is one suspicious activity report, and we've added each incident, including the links to the council, YouTube videos, also notes from myself, and then we added a narrative. So this year is down from last year. If you're looking at actual crimes, I believe the 2 last year were both vandalism related, and then this year we have the 1 single assault that we believe the primary motivation is going to be some type of mental illness and not necessarily a specific ideology. I did want to throw in for context our calls for service this year, or in 2023. The Laramie Police Department handled over 18,000 calls for service, and out of those calls, there was 1 single arrest that had a presumably biased motivation behind it. Usually, our federal partners will release the national data in about May of 2024 for 2023, the previous year. So that'll be updated on last year or on next year's presentation. Last year we reported on 2021 numbers. We want to get this out to you guys as soon as the year begins, so you have an idea of what's happening here locally, which I think is more important than the national nexus. But I wanted to also give you guys a bigger perspective on what's current across the nation. We do expect the religion and the race numbers to increase significantly this year due to incidents occurring in Gaza. So this is kind of what I was talking about before with our collection expectations in the NIBRS participation. The federal goal initially was to have it move fully to NIBRS in 2021 and discontinue our uniform crime reporting. However, most agencies across the nation are still conducting uniform crime reports. We are still reporting those numbers, and part of the reason for that is it still gives our federal partners a comprehensive view of what's occurring across the nation, even though the NIBRS data is more accurate and has more details behind it. So hopefully in the next 2-3 years, as our bigger partners move to it, our federal partners will be able to use that data on a larger scale. So these are the states as they sit. These are the states that have and have not fully transferred to NIBRS. 21 states have fully transferred to NIBRS. Wyoming is close. So the last notification or update that we received from DCI, I believe there were 11 agencies in Wyoming that still are not reporting NIBRS numbers. And there's a lot behind that. When we transitioned to Tyler, it made it a lot easier for us to report those numbers. It's very user-friendly for our records department to transition those numbers, which was part of the reason for our data transfer. But that's a costly program that we went to. A lot of training, as we're now seeing with our ERP partners in the ERP and finance, and throughout the city, a lot of work goes into a transition like that. So for those 11 agencies, it's a lot of money. It's not like they're trying to hold out. I've had an opportunity to talk with some of the sheriffs and chiefs in those areas. And then community considerations. You know, I really want to express to our community that please reach out to one of your law enforcement partners. And if you're not comfortable in that environment, whoever you are comfortable to reaching out, whether it's a member of council, another leader in our community, and hopefully they can make inroads to us so that we can report these. The national estimate is that approximately 250,000 hate incidents or hate crimes go unreported every year. And we want to make sure that we have the best opportunity to investigate these incidences and report them to our federal partners, so we have a really good comprehensive understanding of not only what's going on in our community, but our larger community of Wyoming and the United States as a whole. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Council members, do you have any questions? Yeah, Councilor Doherty, please.
I'm wondering about a scenario like, say someone burns a cross on your front yard. That's like a KKK kind of thing. Would that be, the crime would be arson and then motivated by hate? What would be the charge? I mean, they could, I guess my neighbor could burn a cross on their yard to intimidate me. How would that fall into this scenario? I hope this never happens in Laramie.
Through you, Mayor. So I'll read this, and this is from our federal partners, and this is kind of what they use to separate a hate incident versus a hate crime. And what I would do first off is encourage anybody who has an incident like that, or any incident that they suspect might be a hate incident or hate crime related, is to give us a call and give us the opportunity to come investigate or talk to those people. But there are certain things that are protected under the First Amendment, and this is the guidelines that our federal partners use. Under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, people cannot be prosecuted simply for their beliefs. People may be offended or upset about beliefs that are untrue or based upon false stereotypes. But it is not a crime to express offensive beliefs or to join with others who share such views. However, the First Amendment does not protect against committing a crime just because the conduct is rooted in physiological beliefs. And essentially what they're saying is it kind of depends. There has to be a crime rooted with it. So if someone's burning their own property in their own yard, and it's not against the city ordinance to do it, or there's no local code that's a crime violation, then it would fall in the incident section of it, where we would potentially take a report, document that, notify our federal partners as suspicious activity reports so they have the information. Should something happen later on that leads to a crime, but to be investigated or arrested for doing that, it may not be the case. Now, if they're doing that on your property, in front of your house, or vandalizing your crime, it would be that two-pronged approach that we look for. A motivated hate, bias, belief, coupled with a crime.
Thank you, Chief. Thanks, Councilor. Any other questions? Chief, I have one question about a particular incident that I was made aware of at the Laramie Plains Civic Center of anti-Semitism or like anti-Semitic posters being put up around. I happen to work in the building. And was curious why that's not on our, I think that was mid-December that occurred, why that doesn't show up here.
So that was actually the third incident that I was going to refer to that's not on here that I was
okay.
about. So our school resource officers actually investigated that. And what happened was, without getting in too many specifics, it did involve juveniles, is it was a group of young juveniles who were playing a prank on their friend and were acting completely independent of anything else that was going on in the nation. Very poorly timed, but there wasn't a bias motivation behind it. It was simply because an individual of that religious belief and background, it was actually their birthday, and they put that person's phone number on there, and they were hoping that people would see the flyer and call and mess with them. And we had an opportunity to speak with school officials, the parents, people at the Civic Center, and that's the conclusion that our investigators came to, is that there was not a biased motivation behind the flyers.
Okay, just some sort of weird bullying moment.
Yeah, it was actually, it was young boys, I guess, would be the best way of putting it. It wasn't even intended to bully it. bully the individual. It was intended to, I guess, kind of.
It was their
Bully
friend.
might be the right word, but.
Giving them a hard
Perfect.
time.
Thank you, Chief. Any other questions? All right, we will turn this over to the public. If there's any member of the public wishing to comment on this item, go ahead and come forward in the room or raise your hand on Zoom. Seeing none, I'll close the public comment period. Council members, anything before we close the work session? Thank you so much, Chief. Really appreciate this. All right, we'll move on then to our next work session, establishing a Human Rights Commission. City Manager.
Thank you, Council. I will just open this up briefly to give you a little bit of background. We started in my office in 2019 researching the usefulness of potential Human Rights Commission or Board or Human Relations Commission or Board as something that we could add to the city's advisory board structure. We tabled that in 2020 for the obvious reasons, but we also left it on hold in 21 and 22 as the council worked through the issue of whether to add a police board of some sort. And so we've kind of had it on ice for a while for good reasons and reasons outside of our control. But we thought that this was really the time to bring this issue back to you, give you a little bit of background on what human rights or human relations commissions or boards do around the country in municipal government structures. And then I would like to conclude after Brandon provides the research by talking to you about what I would recommend and gauge the temperature of the council for moving forward in that direction. So with that, I will let our management analyst, Brandon Moen, come up. He's going to talk to you about how these boards look around the country in other municipal governments.
Mr. Moen, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Good evening. So, as Janine said, we've been researching various HRCBs, which does stand for Human Rights and Relations Commissions and Boards. We've been looking into precedent of these boards across the country. They are in many localities in almost every state. The ones that we have listed here on this first page are mainly going to be pertaining to municipalities that have both a higher education institution as well as one that operates in a city manager form of government in order to make it very consistent with the way we operate. As you can see, there are 6 here. The naming is pretty consistent, barring a couple. Human Rights Commission is mainly what they all use. There is one that is the Human Rights and Relations Commission in Edna, Minnesota, and then one in Fort Collins, just south, that uses Human Relations Commission. And on the next page, I will further clarify kind of the conventions around that. But all of these boards are advisory boards except for East Lansing, Michigan. And the difference between an advisory and a quasi-judicial is the ability to conciliate and to carry out some judicial duties as far as hearings regarding the purpose of these commissions, maybe anti-discrimination hearings, things like that. Almost every one of these is an advisory commission where they simply provide education and outreach regarding the purpose of their commissions. As I said, every one of these cities has a higher education institution. Some of them have different actions they can undertake as well as different compositions of their boards or commissions. So as you can see, for instance, Moorhead, they have 1 member that is between 12 and 18 and 3 members that are mandated to be from marginalized groups. Other instances are Edna, where 2 high schoolers are required. They're non-voting members, but it gives them the opportunity to engage with their local government and to provide perspectives that may not otherwise be heard. Again, as you can see, they have different compositions of these boards depending on their municipality and how they decided that, and that's something that's ultimately up to those creating this commission or board. Some examples of things that they can do to provide education and outreach are Fort Collins. There at the bottom, they host activities such as award ceremonies for citizens that carry out activities or that somehow accomplish their goals. Maybe they performed some sort of thing that was beneficial to the purpose of the commission. They also have a human library, which is a forum to bring citizens together to discuss perspectives that may not agree on everything, to sort of create this community cohesion that was kind of in alignment with the purpose of that commission. So in that way, Iowa City has another notable way that they carry out their commission, which is they allocate a budget for this commission who can retroactively reimburse community businesses or organizations that carry out maybe events or activities that further their goal. so they can use some of that money. There is a max there to reimburse these organizations for helping them with their purpose. And then on the second page, the University of Massachusetts conducted a very in-depth study that I'm very thankful for because it certainly helped me in this research. It's 30 pages. It's very dense. They cover 55 different municipalities with either a Human Rights Commission, Human Rights Board, Human Relations Commission, or Board. They identify common themes they see within these of challenges, of upsides, downsides, perspectives, views on them. They help kind of give an insight into best practices and where some learning has been done by other municipalities. There are a few structural challenges that they identified, such as lacking of funding, staffing, resources to manage them. Without having those proper resources, it may not function as intended or not as well as it potentially could. There's a structure, which is, as I discussed previously, there's quasi-judicial, sorry, that's a very hard word, or advisory, which is the difference between conciliation, abilities to take hearings versus simple outreach, education, reaching out to the wider community and facilitating conversation. So there are different benefits or drawbacks for quasi-judicial, wow, twice in a row. Benefits, less oversight and maintenance, but cannot provide the same education and outreach as an advisory board could. Whereas an advisory commission, better education outreach, obviously, but less funding, typically less support as it is more of an advisory committee. It does not need the same oversight, the same constant maintenance. Finally, the scope of anti-discrimination legislation at both the state and local level, either empowering or reducing their ability to carry out their goals. Political challenges, there can be local government and community perspectives. Typically, local governments are very favorable of the commissions they form. However, they may not receive as much support or funding as they may need to carry out their goals. One big issue with communities is their lack of knowledge can lead to misunderstanding or mistrust. Maybe a misconception of the purpose or their powers or things like that can potentially lead to distrust between the community, the wider community, and the commission itself. Differences in intentions between the community and the Human Rights Commission or Relations Commission, as however it's named. It can lead to tensions, can lead to a little conflict between the wider community if the commission is not serving the community in the way the community would like to see. Finally, there are policy considerations to be considered for a commission like this. First of all, there's naming. Rights typically occurs more for the advisory commissions, whereas relations typically goes more towards the judicial form of commission. The naming kind of varies, and it doesn't necessarily entail a certain structure. However, that's just generally how it's been done. As far as authority goes, quasi-judicial HRCs can conduct hearings. Advisory commissions, as I discussed, have this different powers. Seat numbers and composition, typically, almost universally, it's 9 seats. However, there are instances where there are 7 seats. It's up to the municipality to decide what seems best for their specific commission. Terms are almost universally 3 years long, typically a 2-term limit. Finally, there are considerations given in some municipalities to provide seats to the university within their municipality to try and engage the campus community to be involved in the city to provide perspective as far as the goals of these commission go. There's also the ability to bring in youth or younger students that are below 18, maybe high school or middle school students as well. But I would encourage, if you are interested in that study, it is cited on the back. The link is there. It's 30 pages. It's very dense, but it's got a lot of good information for this. It helped drive a lot of this research. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions you guys may have.
Thank you, Mr. Moan. Council members, do you have any questions or comments? Vice Mayor, please.
I appreciate the inclusion of the references so that we can look that up. I think that's very thoughtful.
I felt the same way. Vice Mayor, I'm glad you mentioned that. Anyone else? Yeah, Councilor Richardson, please.
And sorry if you had mentioned this and I missed it, but I think at one point, perhaps City Manager, you had talked about including Disability Commission into this or combining those.
I think I'll kind of dip into that next.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry, I'm jumping again.
Yeah, no problem.
Great. All right. Thank you, Mr. Moan. City Manager, please.
All
All right, council, your third PowerPoint of the evening, but I think I win the award for the shortest one.
You do. I was just thinking the brevity was excellent.
So as I started out by saying, we've been thinking about this for a long time in my office, and I have prepared draft materials to bring this to you if the council has a will to consider it and debate it in a public meeting. What I envision, what I'm sharing with you is what I envision bringing to you. And I invite your feedback because, you know, if you see a critical flaw here and you think, whoa, we would never pass it like that, please let me know, because certainly we're in the process of fine-tuning our recommendation for you based on Brandon's research and our own professional knowledge and skills. So next slide. Am I in charge, Nance? Yeah. Okay. Can I handle this? There we go. All right. So as I've crafted it right now, the purpose and mission of the board would be to uphold Wyoming's constitutional declaration and promise that all members of the human race are equal. And that is literally taken from the second section of the Wyoming Constitution. They would do that by working to defend the dignity and worth of all people and promoting inclusion, equity, and mutual respect among community members. So that's the current draft of purpose and mission. That's pretty typical as far as what you see from other communities, although, as Brandon said, what I am recommending is an advisory body, not a quasi-judicial body. So the quasi-judicial bodies are going to have a different purpose and mission. And of course, the other communities aren't going to reference the Wyoming Constitution, probably. This board would advise city government and help us also to build community. That's how I envision it, and that's the niche I think this board could fill. So it would serve as a public forum. These are like the list of responsibilities it can undertake as currently outlined in the ordinance. It could serve as a public forum for building understanding and cultural awareness. It could recommend or offer programs, activities, or special events, or recognitions, or other kinds of informational, educational information in the community. It could advise the city, our government, on policies and strategies for making municipal government services, programs, systems more accessible and more inclusive for all residents. It could provide city officials and residents with information about changing societal conditions, and it could cooperate with other agencies or organizations, whether they're public or private, whose purposes would be consistent with our Wyoming Constitution and the Laramie Municipal Code. And the reason I mention our municipal code is because, as you know, the council did adopt a non-discrimination ordinance a number of years ago, and that is really the major section of municipal code that would be informing the activities of this council, or excuse me, of this commission. I included an example over here of ways that these activities might support the city. So that top picture is actually our gender-neutral and inclusive restroom at the recreation center. When a few years ago, as a city, we determined we really should have a non-gendered facility, restroom facilities, changing room facilities in our various buildings. You know, it was a lot of research to understand how to do that effectively, how to do it correctly, how to do it in a way that people would feel comfortable using it if that was an amenity that was important to them. And so this commission could advise us, how do we create changing rooms that are welcoming for everyone and safe and make people feel more able to maybe use the recreation center, for example, or we have a gender-neutral bathroom as well in this building. How do we make sure the public are aware of that and gain access to it if they choose? And then, of course, from our homecoming parade, this lovely picture here of one of the parade entrants. But the commission could advise on how we recognize being on native lands. You know, that is something that is increasingly embraced around the country, where we are in spaces and on lands that were formerly inhabited by native peoples. How do we respect that contribution? And again, these are not expertises that necessarily city staff have. We're trained to be engineers and city managers. And so this board could advise us in those respects. I also included the mural from downtown Laramie here of our Black 14. They can help us to memorialize and recognize history and progress in the community in its many forms. So next slide is kind of how I envision structuring it. I thought we should have a 9-member commission, but I guess it's actually really a 7-member commission because there are 7 voting members. 6 would be Laramie residents, and they would all vote. And then I am recommending that we have 1 Laramie youth member under the age of 25. This is totally up for debate, council, but we do have a significant population of college-age students. Our average age in the community, I think, is 27.4 or something. So this would give council the latitude to appoint high school students on up through college students, depending on the expertise and interest of the applicants. That youth member, also a voting member, and then the city manager and someone you appoint from the governing body as serving on the commission as well, but as non-voting members. Okay, and the way we're written now is at minimum quarterly meetings. All of those meetings, as with all of our boards and commissions, would be open to the public and public participation. The committee would be staffed out of my office, and we could have the ability to invite experts, guests, and speakers as well to participate and augment the content and the discussions that the group might have. Here's a few examples from some of the communities that Brandon mentioned that we thought were really strong corollaries to Laramie because they are manager-council forms of government, and they are also dominated by higher education institutions. So Charlottesville, they had a great newsletter. They host community forums, and they also participated, this surprised me a little bit, but they participated in the city's creation of an ADA transition plan. And as you know, we have an ADA transition plan as well from 2015 for parks and recreation facilities, but we didn't have a commission to kind of bounce that off of and get their feedback on back at that time. In Moorhead, Minnesota, they have a program that sponsors community events that promote diversity and inclusiveness and bring people together from different backgrounds. And in Fort Collins, I really liked this program. They have a community awards and recognition. So the top picture is they awarded one of their tribal organizations in Fort Collins with the group award, and then they award individuals as well that are leading in this area within their community. So that's it, really. That's sort of the outline and the recommendation that I would bring to you if you would like to entertain that, and it will require an ordinance. So it would be three readings, so 3 public meetings and 3 public debates and dialogue and discussion. And I'm happy to answer your questions, Council.
Thank you, City Manager. Councilors, any questions at this point? If we move forward, obviously, we'll have specific conversation, but.
I just realized I should go back, Mayor, to Councilor Richardson's question. So, Council, I know that this fits in this broader goal that you have to evaluate our board and commission structure as a whole and figure out if there's ways we can streamline it. So, the way this is written right now, it does not directly get at the portion of our Disabilities Commission that they have various missions and purposes, but there is a portion of their mission and purpose that overlaps here, right? And so there is, in my opinion, the potential to integrate that portion of the Disabilities Commission's mission under the broader umbrella that this commission would be, because it could deal with disabilities, but it can also deal with different types of difference, right? So I did not draft it at this point in that way, but it's certainly a conversation that we could have. What it would mean is if we were to take disability awareness and education and dialogue, community forums, et cetera, and move that under this commission. It'd be easy to do that, but then we're going to want to have a subsequent or a tandem motion where we revise the Disability Commission's scope of responsibilities, purpose, and mission, and maybe refine it down. And then the question will be, and we're going to have another work session on boards and commissions in like 2 weeks, so the question will be, what is left for the Disabilities Commission? And as I read their mission, what would be left is the focus on physical infrastructure, physical accessibility. How do we get across sidewalks? How do we get across alley pans? And so when I think about that, I think, well, that's something that we could take the physical assets and accessibility question and move over into another committee, like maybe Traffic Commission, by changing and modifying slightly and expanding their scope. And then the result could be dissolving the Disabilities Commission, keeping the work they do, just putting it under 2 different committees. So that is a conversation we can have. It's a little more complicated than I wanted to get tonight, to just introduce you to this topic, but it's definitely worthy of going down that road, I think, given your broad goal adopted this year to streamline boards and commissions. Did that all make sense? Okay.
Yeah, it's appreciated. Thank you, City Manager. Other questions, council? For what it's worth, I'm very favorable to this. I would get the sense that council is as well. I did wonder about the youth member. I think that we should have a youth member. I just wonder if under 25 really captures what would be considered young in Laramie, to your point of the average age being 27. Being 25 puts you almost at the average citizen's age. So, I would say that there should be a person in that age range, certainly, but there may be space for us to carve out a yet younger member that maybe is specifically targeted towards maybe a youth council person or somebody in sort of the high school age range. And I think in general, younger generations tend to be more forward-thinking on some of these things and able to inform those of us who are no longer in that generation. So I think there would be benefit of us looking to younger folks on how to make these decisions and certainly asking for their input. And then the other thing I wanted to note is I did think that idea that Mr. Moen mentions about being able to create a stipend program to fund community projects, sort of community organizations working in this space, to me that felt compelling because I think sometimes, as you said, we're trained to be city managers and engineers. We're not event coordinators. We're not great at hosting exciting public events. Like we can tell you a lot of at times we're great, but largely we can bring you a lot of information and we do a lot of things well, but there are other organizations that I think do a remarkable job and have built-in communities, and we should find a way to support them. I think that's a really powerful way of this organization's work going outside of just sort of city hall practices and maybe having a bigger effect on the community, which is what I would hope it would do.
Absolutely. Mayor, if I can respond to that.
Please.
I'm 100% of a like mind with you, and I'll kind of give you a preview of something I'm working on for the budget recommendation. As we've tried to move the needle on, survey data about, does the city communicate with me enough? Do they share enough information? Do they accept my feedback? Things like that. It's been so hard to move that needle. I mean, I've been seeing survey data for 20 years, and it's hardly moved. And you all know how much we've done to try to move that in the needle, how much activity, effort, and money spent to try to move the needle. So my newest idea for budget is I'll be bringing you a recommendation to give our boards and commissions that have a mission like this one would, education, public information, to give them a little stipend so that they could do some outreach. Maybe Traffic Commission wants to go out and talk to people about speed limits, right? They're interested in lowering the speed limit. Well, they would have a small public relations or public information budget that they could do that with. I'm thinking just a few thousand for the boards and commissions who have public education in their mission. And so if we do that, Mayor, this one would too. My hope is that maybe if people hear from their friends and neighbors who are volunteer appointees on these boards and commissions, maybe they receive information about city services in a different way than they receive it when we send out official communications. So I would
great.
absolutely agree. Stipend, I think, would be important if we're going to encumber this group or any group with such a heavy lift, which is trying to share information with the public. They have to have a budget.
Thank you, City Manager. And I think that would be an interesting thing to know which boards and commissions are tasked with an education component when you bring back that other work session. And then maybe just for a finer point on it, I think this group, if we were asking them to take this into the public, it might require a bigger stipend than, say, the Traffic Commission doing a PR effort around speed limits. I certainly think that's a great idea, boards and commissions wide, but if we want them to support sort of like being able to fund an event at the Soup Kitchen or the Public Art Coalition, they'll burn through $2,000 or something in a weekend. So I'm not saying we fund them every weekend to do it, but giving them some runway, I think, would be impactful. So I think we'll see our return on our investment in sort of our cultural vibrancy. Others?
Are we taking comments?
Sure, comment away. Free for all.
Okay.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation and your move forward on this. And as you were presenting, I thought about 3 years ago when we began the Police Community Relations Ad Hoc Committee. And we worked on that as a community group for 6 months, that there were many concerns expressed, and then we tried our best to narrow it down. But there was a whole category of concerns and desires that, with our final result of a police advisory board, it met many of the concerns, but there were concerns that will not be met through that board. And I believe that this board is a way to meet those concerns that were not met or would not appropriately be met through a police advisory board. And it's the other half of what the community was expressing concerns about. So I applaud you on this. I think it's a very positive move and would be helpful to our community.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. All right. We'll go to the public on this. If there's any member of the public wishing to speak to this item, go ahead and come forward in the room. Raise your hand if you are on the Zoom call. Seeing none, I'm going to close the public comment. Council members, anything before we wrap up? Okay. Do you feel like you got what you need, City Manager?
I do. So, Council, what I'm hearing is I will prepare a first reading for an
Please.
upcoming meeting for you. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, City Manager. Appreciate the efforts that went into this, both you and the management analyst. Thank you both. All right, we'll close that public comment. We're going to move on to council updates, council comments. Councilor Doherty?
Because we were on the topic of disabilities, I want to commend, I'm sure the staff was involved with this Culture City. I mean, that just is something that you all do. I would like that to come to the attention of, at our next council meeting, that we announce that we're Culture City. And it's about people with sensory issues.
Thank you.
So I
make sure we get
would like the Disability Commission to, help promote, because it's about invisible
Right.
disabilities. And I think there are a lot of them, and that's something maybe we could focus on.
Sure.
So for my report, the Disability Committee meets next month, and Environmental Advisory Committee is going to have an extra meeting to talk about the Corinne Sheshka's roadmap for carbon neutrality. And I think that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor Doherty. Councilor Shumway? Thank you. Councilor Pierce?
Thank you, Mayor. Nothing at this time.
Great. Nothing from me either. I have an airport meeting in the morning. Vice Mayor?
The Albany County Mental Health Board met on February 5th, and I gave a report on the update on the Police Advisory Board. And we also were introduced to Aaron Parvia. I can't read my own writing, but Robbie's House has a new executive director. They're increasing hours to include evening and day hours and additional meals, et cetera. So they are moving forward with their organizational work. The Police Advisory Board met on February 6th for a training, and that was very informative, and our new member, Liz Powers, joined us for that board. Town and Gown is continuing with the certification program. We met Wednesday on the 7th, and we were looking at strategies for implementing a town and gown that coordinates within both the city and the university. And it was very interesting, and it was And then Monday, there was Planning Commission, and I think there were some smaller things that were worked with, but they returned to the zoning of the property at Beach Street in Boulder that's part of the Turner Trek, and Cornerstone did not receive funding, so the Planning Commission or the Planning Department is trying to clarify the zoning on that so that future possible developers can look at that property and know what they have. The commission suggested to better clarify on that property what is developable, and what is not. And so the retention pond, the drainage areas would not be able to be developed, and they thought that it would be better if that were clarified. So Planning Department will be doing that. And the last thing is that the Planning Department has released an RFP to developers asking for input on mixed-use development for the North 4th Street property. And so that is out there and on the web, and so we're looking for some good ideas.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. That's really exciting. Councilor Newman.
I don't have any updates on any of my boards, but I have a comment. For the second time, our local competitive cheerleading team is going to Worlds, and it's only the second time that somebody from Wyoming has made it.
That's excellent. Congratulations to them. I appreciate you keeping us up on that. It is exciting. Councilor Richardson, please.
Met with DDA today, Downtown Development Authority, prior to this meeting, and it sounds as though they will at least be moving forward with trying to do a little bit of kind of planning on roles and goals within that organization, and working on some sort of a survey that will go out to businesses and owners downtown. Additionally, met with Laramie Public Art Coalition, and now they have received some large and wonderful grants, but now I can't remember which ones I'm not supposed to talk about and which ones I am, because they haven't been publicly announced yet, so they're just doing great. Good job, LPAC. Sorry about that. Next time I'll be able to announce it for sure. And then I just wanted to also mention, I saw the WHAM paper here, just for council members to know that there are a lot of property tax bills that are being discussed currently at the legislature. So talking with folks about what those taxes mean to the city and all of the resources here in town to be aware of, and that another bill that WHAM was following, HB 70, which is local government distributions, has moved through, so it is still alive and might be one that you want to pay attention to and talk to your legislators about as well.
Thank you, Councilor.
Mayor, I was hoping either Councilor Newman or Councilor Riches would report on the Laramie Youth Council.
Oh my gosh, that was last week. Do you want me to do it? Do you want to do it? Sure. Okay.
All three of us were there.
We were all
Great.
three there. Sorry, I've lost track of time now of all the things. And I don't have my notes down because we went to the soup kitchen and got a tour from Ted Kramer there, which was wonderful. And then he had a lot of insights about what they can and can't do at the soup kitchen that other places, well, more of what they can do than what some of the other places in town can do in terms of feeding folks, and then came back and have worked on their priority areas again, which are mental health, civic engagement, and food insecurity, speaking of the soup kitchen. So, good group.
They're going to the legislative group.
Legislation on the 19th, right, Nancy?
Sure.
Yep.
With Nancy. So.
Great. Thank you. Councilor Gabriel?
Thanks, Mayor. Vice Mayor, Councilor O'Doherty and I met today and interviewed an excellent candidate for the Planning Commission. we had resignation, and so we had one applicant for one vacancy. And we were very impressed with the applicant, and that will be on our agenda in the future.
Next week.
Shortly.
Next
Next
week.
week, hopefully.
on
Okay,
there,
great.
yep. Thank you,
So we
Councilor
did that
Gabriel.
today. I attended the Railroad Depot Board meeting last week, and they're moving along very well. One of the main things they're trying to do down there is take care of the pigeon problem. And they've had spikes up there before, but they don't have them in all of these, the very like over the doors and some of the other areas, and so they've experienced some problems there, and so they've hired somebody to come in and take care of the areas that need it, and they have the money to do that, maybe around $6,000. So they're going to do that as the weather improves and hopefully clean up that area because they've got some problems down there. But anyway, other than that, I think that's about all I have.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Gabriel. Council members, we'll hop into a quick agenda review. I have just a couple notes on the agenda for you, 4 changes that you'll see on the final agenda when it's published. You will first see that item 9D is actually going to end up on the regular agenda. It's going to end up at $130,000, so it seems right to move that to our regular agenda. Item 11 will sub out, and it's going to the consent agenda because it is just $31,000. And then the final change you'll see is 12 and 13 are going to be combined to just, I suppose that would be to issue the amendment as well as award the bid at the same time. So any other questions beyond that? You will see that Planning Commission member on there, Councilor Gabriel. Thanks again for doing those interviews, councilors and vice mayor. Okay. Thanks, council members. We're adjourned.